I have lived on very little money. I have also made a great deal of money. And if you force me to tell you the truth I learned from both sides of that experience, it is not that money changes the rules of life. It is that money changes which mistake is most likely to destroy you. That is what people miss. They think financial advice should sound the same no matter what a person earns. Save more. Spend less, invest, avoid debt. Those are not bad principles. They are just too broad to be useful at the moment. A real person sits down and asks, what exactly should I do with the income I have right now? The truth is simpler and more uncomfortable. At different income levels, you are fighting different enemies. When you are making very little, the enemy is fragility. When you are making more, the enemy is. When you are making a lot, the enemy is often imitation. That is how I would frame it. Not by income bracket as an identity, not by class signaling, not by numbers for their own sake, by the main financial danger trying to attach itself to your life at that stage. If I were speaking plainly, as I prefer to do, I would say it this way. At lower income, the job is to get breathing room. At middle income, the job is to turn breathing room into systems. At higher income, the job is to stop using money to purchase a life that looks successful while quietly becoming less free. Those are very different jobs, and if you do the job from the wrong level, you create confusion. A person making $35,000 who tries to optimize portfolio complexity before building a shock absorber is playing the wrong game. A person making $75,000 who still obsesses over every tiny purchase while ignoring retirement accounts and automation is playing the wrong game. A person making well over $100,000 who keeps buying houses, trucks, fees, and identity, because that is what successful people are supposed to do, is also playing the wrong game. I have seen all three. They are equally real. So let me tell you how I think about it. If I were in the lower band, call it $35,000 a year, I would not flatter myself with grand financial language. I would not pretend the first priority was maximizing return. The first priority at that level is to stop living one inconvenience away from disaster. That is the real issue. People in that range often know exactly how expensive being poor can be. A small car repair is not small. A medical bill is not just a bill. A missed shift, a delay in pay, a busted appliance, a rise in rent, any of these can hit like a hammer because the system has no room. When there is no room, ordinary bad luck becomes a financial emergency. And once you are in emergency, the choices get uglier. You use the card. You take the terrible loan. You skip something important. You juggle. You pay fees to survive until next week. That is how $100 becomes a $1,000 problem. This is why I have always said that the first goal at lower income is not wealth in the glamorous sense. It is breathing room. Breathing room is one of the most underestimated luxuries in the world. It does not photograph well. Nobody congratulates you on having it. But it changes the entire emotional temperature of your life. A person with breathing room can think. A person without it is often just reacting. So if I were making $35,000 and trying to improve my position, I would make the first months boring and aggressive in exactly the right way. I would save 5 to 10% of take home pay, even if the amount felt insultingly small. I would build the first emergency reserve. I would look at every recurring cost and ask whether it was keeping me alive or simply keeping me distracted. I would negotiate where I could. I would cut where I could. And I would stop pretending that tiny leaks do not matter when the whole ship is already riding low. People hate this kind of advice because they think it sounds like punishment. But I do not think of it that way. I think of it as buying shock absorption, $50, $100, $200. The amount matters less in the beginning than the function. Once that first layer of money exists, The next surprise is no longer fully in charge. That is power. Now, at the same time, if there is high interest debt, I would not romanticize it. I would list it out. Every balance, every rate, every due date. People love staying vague around debt because vagueness protects the ego. The ego hates being told that the card is not manageable but actively hostile. Too bad. Reality does not care what flatters you. If the debt is expensive enough, paying it off is not merely responsible. It is a phenomenal, guaranteed return. I do not care whether the person prefers the avalanche method because it is mathematically superior or the snowball because it gives emotional wins. I care that the debt stops being invisible. That is where progress begins. And then there is the third thing that matters most at lower income, which some people dislike hearing because it sounds unfair. But it is still true. You can only cut so much. At some point, the biggest lever is earning more. I wish the world made this easier. I wish housing were cheaper. I wish transportation were less mandatory in so much of the country. I wish wages covered more. But I have never found fantasy to be a useful budgeting tool. Reality is what we have to negotiate with. And reality says this: if you are stuck near the low end of income, the long-term escape route almost always involves increasing earning power, not waiting for a miracle raise, not endlessly replaying how unfair the system is, not assuming the current role will eventually become generous out of gratitude. It means learning a skill, entering a higher demand room, building something on the side, asking better, paid people how they got there, stacking proof, starting before you feel fully qualified, and refusing to let today's job become tomorrow's identity. I have seen people change their financial lives, not because they were uniquely gifted, but because they stopped assuming the current number was destiny. That is a very important shift. Now let us move to the middle band, call it $75,000 a year. This is where things get interesting, because this income often creates just enough space for people to feel safe while still being sloppy enough to miss a tremendous opportunity. That is why I say the enemy at this stage is drift. At $75,000, many people finally feel a little relief. Bills are more manageable. There may be some savings. The intensity of survival has eased. This is precisely where some people make their next great mistake. They relax into the salary as if income alone is the finish line. They treat the raise as proof that the financial problem has been solved. It has not. It has merely become less visible. This range is where systems matter. If lower income is about building breathing room, middle income is about deciding whether breathing room will become freedom or simply become a nicer cage. I have seen this go both ways. One person gets to this income and starts using the room wisely. Emergency savings rise, debt gets organized and reduced. Employer benefits are used, retirement accounts get funded, transfers are automated. A modest amount of planning turns into a large amount of future wealth because structure now has something to work with. Another person gets to the same income and does something else. The apartment gets upgraded, the spending gets fuzzier. The tiny questions stay front and center because worrying over tiny questions feels like responsibility, while the large questions remain unasked. The person becomes busier with money without becoming freer. That is tragic because this band is often where the compounding machine can really begin. I have long believed that one of the smartest moments in a person's financial life is when he learns to stop asking $3 questions and starts asking $30,000 questions. Should I save $3 on groceries? Should I skip this coffee? Should I cancel this tiny subscription? At very low income, those things can matter while you are building initial stability. But once you have reached some breathing room, becoming obsessed with them is often a form of productive looking avoidance. It lets you feel diligent while sidestepping the larger, more consequential decisions. The larger questions are where the real money lives. Am I capturing every dollar of my employer match? Am I using tax-advantaged accounts? Is my investment structure efficient? Am I paying too much in fees? Can I negotiate a meaningful raise? What happens if I increase savings by 1% every year for a decade? Am I automating enough that my future is not being decided by whatever mood I am in on the 25th of each month? Those are grown-up questions. If an employer offers a match, I would take it with almost religious seriousness. Free money is rare. It is astonishing how many people leave it untouched because they were too distracted, too intimidated, or too casual to do the paperwork. That is not complexity, that is negligence. Likewise, if tax-advantaged accounts are available, use them. The world is full of people chasing exotic opportunities while ignoring the plain, powerful, tax-efficient structures in front of them. That is one of the dumbest forms of sophistication I know. And then comes automation, which I consider one of the great breakthroughs in practical personal finance. A person who relies on remembering to transfer money is relying on a weak employee. A person who automates is relying on infrastructure. I trust infrastructure more. A good system sends money to the right places before the rest of life gets a vote. Retirement savings, investing, bills. Goal funds. Once the system is built, you review it occasionally, but you do not ask willpower to carry the whole structure every single month. Willpower is too moody. Systems are stubborn. I like stubborn. This is also the stage where a person should begin to understand that wealth is not about appearing to have options. It is about actually building them. Every automated transfer, every percentage of income sent to the right account, every tax shelter funded, every fee reduced, every extra dollar directed with intention rather than drift, all of it widens future choice. And now we come to the upper band, over $100,000 a year. People assume this is where money becomes easy. It often becomes more deceptive. At this level, the danger is not usually that there is no room. The danger is that the room gets filled with things that look like success and behave like traps. That is why I say the enemy here is imitation. Many high earners are not poor in the technical sense. They are poor in imagination. They inherit a script of what freedom is supposed to look like. Bigger house, nicer neighborhood, more expensive car, fancier vacations, lifestyle upgrades stacked one on top of another, because this is what somebody with money is supposed to do. I have always found that odd, so many people say they want freedom, and then describe a life that is really just a more expensive version of everyone else's expectations. That is not freedom. That is conformity with better upholstery. The question at higher income is not whether you can afford a larger life in the visible sense. The question is what kind of life you are trying to fund and why. If you do not define rich for yourself, the culture will do it for you. And the culture's definition tends to be crowded, expensive, and derivative. It tells you the house means success. The truck means success. The private school means success. The luxury building means success. The advisor charging 1% forever feels successful because having a guy makes you feel like a person whose money has become complex enough to require ceremony. I have no interest in ceremony that invoices the future. That 1% fee is a beautiful example of a rich-looking trap. It sounds tiny. It is sold as convenience. It signals adulthood and professionalism. Yet over decades, that little fee can carve an astonishing piece out of your compounding. People hand over 6 figures of future wealth because the present arrangement feels polished. That is one reason I have so much respect for low-cost index investing. Not because it is glamorous, precisely because it is not. It removes ego. It removes expensive theater. It lets broad participation in good businesses do the work, while costs stay low enough that the future keeps more of what it earns. Now, I am not saying all advisors are useless. There are transitions where a wise human being can be extremely helpful. But I want the economics understood. A flat fee or project fee can be a different animal from a permanent percentage claim on your future. The person with money should know the difference. Not simply purchase reassurance, because reassurance sounds sophisticated. And then there is housing. Few subjects expose financial imitation as clearly as housing. People have been told so often that buying a house is the responsible thing, the adult thing, the wealth-building thing, that many never bother to examine the numbers. They inherit a story instead. I do not invest in stories. I invest in economics. Sometimes buying makes great sense. Sometimes renting is the superior decision. Sometimes the flexibility of renting is worth more than the mythology of ownership. Sometimes ownership creates stability and satisfaction that justify the cost. Sometimes it is just an altar built to cultural expectation. The point is not to be ideological. The point is to run the numbers honestly. Down payment, mortgage interest, taxes, insurance, maintenance, transaction costs, opportunity cost of the capital tied up, how long you truly expect to stay. What that monthly difference could become if invested elsewhere. These are not small questions. They may be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars over time. Yet people often spend more time choosing a phone plan than evaluating the largest purchase of their lives. That is madness. The same goes for cars. A truck financed because it fits the story of your life may be far more expensive than the machine itself. It can become a tax on future freedom, especially when the justification is thin and the identity payoff is high. That is why higher income requires something very particular, restraint not against scarcity, but against social permission. At this level, many purchases become possible. That does not make them intelligent. The discipline required is deeper. Not, can I afford this month? But what does this commit my future to? Not, will people understand this choice? But is it the right trade-off for the life I actually want? Not, does this look like success? But does it widen or narrow the freedom my money was supposed to buy? I have always cared more about the inner scorecard than the outer one. At higher income, that principle becomes even more important, because the outer scorecard is everywhere. It is in the neighborhood, in the expectations of peers, in the way the financial industry sells to you, in the way lifestyle industries speak to you, in the assumptions about what a high earner must naturally want. A person who never defines his own rich life becomes easy prey. And so if I were to compress all of this into one lesson, it would be this. At every income, money asks you a different question. At lower income, it asks, can you create breathing room before life turns another surprise into a debt spiral? At middle income, it asks, can you convert breathing room into systems before drift absorbs the advantage? At higher income, it asks, can you resist confusing success with imitation long enough to define what freedom actually means to you? Those are the right questions. And underneath all of them sits one rule I trust deeply. Money is useful only when it buys something more durable than appearance. If it buys you less panic, good. If it buys you time, good. If it buys you resilience, good. If it buys you the ability to invest steadily, good. If it buys you the right not to copy a script you do not even believe in, very good. But if it mostly buys a life designed to be recognized by others while remaining structurally fragile underneath, then the money is doing a poor job no matter how high the income looks. That is not wealth. That is expensive obedience. I would rather have a quieter life with stronger margins. I would rather have broad, low-cost investing than polished fees. I would rather have emergency reserves than impressive furniture bought to soothe a hard week. I would rather have a deliberate renter with capital compounding than an anxious owner worshiping a story. I would rather have a plain car and a stronger future than a truck that flatters my image while leasing back my freedom month by month. Those are not anti-money ideas. They are pro-purpose ideas, and purpose is what turns income into wealth. That is the real point. Not merely to make more, to assign more intelligently, not merely to buy bigger, to buy better, not merely to keep up, to become hard to corner. Over a long life, that difference becomes enormous. A lower income person who learns to build a shock absorber is changed. A middle income person who builds systems is changed. A high income person who refuses to imitate and instead defines rich for himself is changed. All three are doing the same deeper thing. They are taking money away from reaction and handing it to intention. That is the first step toward a life that finally feels like your own. And if you can do that, the numbers start to matter in a much better way. They stop being only evidence of what you earn. They begin becoming evidence of what you have chosen to keep, build, protect, and become. That is the kind of money story I respect.